I'm Eve, 29, and this is the story of how my mother-in-law's cruelty taught me the true value of my own worth. You know that feeling when someone looks at you like you're nothing more than a threat to their perfect world? That's exactly how Margaret, my husband's mother, looked at me from the very first day we met. She had this way of scanning me from head to toe, taking in my secondhand dress, my nervous smile, my calloused hands from years of working double shifts as a nurse. In that single glance, she decided who I was and what I was worth. And for the longest time, I let her judgment define me, but sometimes life has a funny way of turning the tables. Sometimes the person who spends years making you feel small ends up needing you more than they ever imagined possible. And when that moment comes, you discover something powerful about yourself, something that no amount of money or social status can buy. You discover your own strength, your own worth, and the incredible power that comes from knowing exactly who you are. This is the story of how I learned that lesson the hard way, and how the woman who called me a gold digger ended up begging me to save her life. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. Let me take you back to where it all began. I grew up in a small apartment above my grandmother's bakery, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sound of her arthritic hands kneading dough at 4 in the morning. Money was always tight, but love was abundant. My grandmother taught me that hard work wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. She'd watch me study at the kitchen table after my shifts at the local diner, her eyes filled with hope for a future she never had the chance to pursue. By the time I turned 18, I had already been working for 4 years. Weekends at the diner, summers cleaning office buildings, evenings tutoring younger kids for extra cash. Every dollar went toward my dream of becoming a nurse. I believed deeply that healing people was my calling, and I was willing to sacrifice everything to make it happen. Nursing school was brutal. I worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for tuition, books, and living expenses. My days started at 5 in the morning with a cleaning job at a medical office, followed by classes, then an evening shift at a retirement home. My hands were constantly dry from sanitizer and cleaning chemicals, my feet ached from standing for 12-hour stretches, and I survived on coffee and determination. That's when I met David. It was during my final year of nursing school in a psychology elective I'd squeezed into my impossible schedule. He was finishing his pre-law degree, always sitting in the front row with perfectly pressed shirts and an expensive leather briefcase. I, on the other hand, usually slipped in 5 minutes late, still in my scrubs from the hospital, trying to catch my breath and find an empty seat in the back. The first time he spoke to me was after a particularly challenging exam. I was gathering my things, exhausted and worried I'd failed, when he approached my desk. "You look like you could use some coffee," he said with a gentle smile. "There's a cafe across the street." My treat. What struck me wasn't his offer. It was the way he looked at me. Not with pity or condescension, but with genuine interest and respect. He asked about my work at the hospital, listened intently as I described my patients, and seemed genuinely impressed by my dedication. For the first time in years, someone saw my hard work as admirable rather than unfortunate. Our relationship developed slowly, built on late-night study sessions and stolen moments between my shifts. David would bring me dinner when I worked late, help me review for exams, and listen patiently as I worried about tuition payments and upcoming boards. He never made me feel ashamed of my struggles or tried to solve all my problems with his family's money. Instead, he respected my independence and supported my dreams. 6 months into our relationship, he mentioned bringing me home to meet his parents. The way his expression shifted when he talked about his family should have been my first warning. His jaw tightened, his easy smile became forced, and he spent an unusual amount of time coaching me on topics of conversation and appropriate attire. "My mother can be particular," he said carefully. "She has certain expectations about the people in our family's social circle. Just be yourself, but maybe don't mention the multiple jobs or the financial struggles. She wouldn't understand." I should have recognized the red flag in that moment. The implication that who I was, a hardworking, determined woman fighting for her dreams, wasn't good enough for his family. But I was young and in love, and I wanted desperately to be accepted by the people who mattered to him. The Whitmore estate was everything I'd imagined and feared: manicured gardens, marble columns, and a circular driveway that could have housed my entire apartment building. Margaret Whitmore answered the door herself, though I suspected she had staff who normally handled such tasks. She was elegant in that effortless way that comes from a lifetime of privilege: perfect posture, tasteful jewelry, and an expression that managed to be polite and dismissive simultaneously. Her handshake was brief and cold. Her eyes performed that same head-to-toe scan I mentioned earlier, taking inventory of my department store dress, my practical shoes, and my hands that no amount of lotion could make soft. In those first 30 seconds, I watched her categorize me as temporary, unworthy, and potentially dangerous to her carefully constructed world. Throughout dinner, her questions were surgical in their precision. She asked about my family background, my educational investments, and my career aspirations, in a way that felt more like an interrogation than friendly conversation. Each answer I gave seemed to confirm whatever negative assumptions she'd already made. When I mentioned my grandmother's bakery, she smiled tightly and said, "How quaint." When I explained my work at the retirement home, she nodded with false sympathy and murmured, "How difficult that must be." And when David proudly mentioned my academic achievements despite working multiple jobs, she simply said, "Well, everyone has their own path, don't they?" That night, as David walked me to my car, I could feel the weight of her disapproval settling over our relationship like a heavy blanket. I knew, with absolute certainty, that Margaret Whitmore had decided I wasn't good enough for her son. What I didn't know was just how far she'd go to prove it. David proposed 2 years later, on a quiet evening after I'd finished my nursing boards. He'd waited until I passed my licensing exam, knowing how important it was for me to achieve that milestone on my own. The ring was beautiful but modest, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. We were sitting on the fire escape of my tiny apartment, sharing takeout Chinese food and planning our future together. "I want to marry you, Eve," he said simply. "I want to build a life with someone who understands what hard work means, someone who fights for what matters." His proposal was perfect because it recognized who I was rather than trying to change me into someone else. Planning our wedding became my first real battle with Margaret. David and I wanted something small and meaningful. A ceremony at the community center where I'd volunteered during nursing school, followed by a reception in Niufiti, the adjacent garden. It was beautiful in its simplicity, surrounded by people who had actually supported us through our struggles. My grandmother had offered to cater the reception herself, creating an elaborate spread of the pastries and dishes that had sustained me through childhood. Margaret's reaction was swift and cutting. "A community center?" she repeated when David told her our plans, her voice dripping with barely concealed horror. "David, sweetheart, what will people think? The Whitmore family has certain standards to maintain." She launched into a campaign to upgrade everything. She suggested venues that cost more than my annual salary, florists whose arrangements could have funded a semester of nursing school, and photographers whose fees exceeded my monthly rent. Each suggestion came wrapped in concern for David's reputation and thinly veiled criticism of my choices. "I'm sure Eve's grandmother is a lovely baker," Margaret said during one particularly tense planning session. "But perhaps we should consider having the reception catered by professionals. After all, this is David's wedding too, and his associates will be attending." The implication was clear. My family's contributions weren't sophisticated enough for their social circle. My grandmother, who had started baking at 4 a.m. every day for 50 years, wasn't professional enough. The community center where I'd spent hundreds of hours helping elderly residents wasn't prestigious enough. Nothing about my world met their standards. David tried to navigate between us, but I could see the pressure wearing on him. His mother had a way of making her disapproval feel like disappointment rather than judgment, as if she were only concerned about his happiness and reputation. She never directly criticized me. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she expressed worry about his future, concern about how his career might be affected, and gentle suggestions that perhaps we were rushing into things. We held our ground and had the wedding we wanted. It was beautiful, intimate, genuine, and filled with people who truly cared about us. My grandmother's food was extraordinary. The community center was decorated with flowers from local gardens, and our photographer was a friend from nursing school who captured every moment with love and skill. But Margaret's presence cast a shadow over the entire day. She arrived dressed entirely in black, as if attending a funeral. She smiled for photos, but spent most of the reception sitting with David's father, speaking in hushed tones with the few family members who had attended. I watched her survey the modest decorations, the homemade food, and my family's genuine celebration with an expression of resigned disappointment. During her toast, she managed to sound supportive while delivering subtle insults. "We're so happy to welcome Eve into our family," she said, raising her glass. "David has always had such a generous heart, always drawn to helping others. We're confident that Eve will grow into the role of being a Whitmore wife." The message was unmistakable. I was a charity case he was helping, someone who needed to be transformed into something worthy of their family name. The early years of our marriage only intensified these dynamics. David started his career at a prestigious law firm, working brutal hours but earning the kind of salary that gradually lifted us into a more comfortable lifestyle. I continued working as a nurse, loving my job but earning significantly less than my husband. Margaret never missed an opportunity to highlight this disparity. During family dinners, she would ask David extensively about his cases, his clients, and his career prospects, hanging on every word as if he were delivering profound wisdom. When she turned to me, her questions were perfunctory. "How's work, dear?" Followed immediately by a pivot back to David's accomplishments. She had a particular talent for making my contributions to our marriage invisible. When we bought our first house, a modest 2-bedroom that we could afford because I had carefully saved and budgeted every penny of our combined income, she toured it with David, praising his success in providing such a lovely home. The fact that my financial planning and nursing salary had made the purchase possible never entered the conversation. When David received a promotion, Margaret organized a family celebration. When I was selected for a leadership role at my hospital, managing a team of 12 nurses and implementing new patient care protocols, the achievement went unmentioned at family gatherings. She developed a pattern of asking David about his decisions that were actually ours. "David, how did you decide on this neighborhood?" she'd ask, when I had spent weeks researching schools, crime statistics, and property values. "David, what made you choose this car?" when I had negotiated the purchase price and arranged the financing. Slowly, methodically, Margaret was erasing me from my own marriage, making me feel like a silent partner in a life that David was building alone. And the most painful part was watching him accept this narrative, allowing his mother to rewrite our partnership into his individual success story. I began to understand that this wasn't just about class or money. It was about power, control, and Margaret's determination to maintain her position as the most important woman in her son's life. What Margaret never understood, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that David and I had built something real together, a true partnership that went far beyond what anyone could see from the outside. While she focused on appearances and social status, we were quietly creating a life based on mutual support, shared sacrifice, and genuine teamwork. The first few years of our marriage were challenging in ways that had nothing to do with his mother's disapproval. David was working toward making partner at his firm, which meant 16-hour days, weekend work, and the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of advancement. Meanwhile, I was establishing myself at the hospital, taking on additional responsibilities, and building relationships with colleagues who would become lifelong friends. But here's what made our marriage work. We understood that success meant different things at different times, and we were willing to carry each other through the tough periods. When David decided to take the bar exam in a neighboring state to expand his practice opportunities, it meant months of intensive studying on top of his already demanding schedule. He would come home exhausted, barely able to focus on anything beyond case law and legal precedents. That's when I stepped up in ways that Margaret never acknowledged or understood. I took over everything. Not just the obvious household tasks like cooking and cleaning, but the invisible work that keeps a life running smoothly. I managed our finances, tracked our expenses, and found ways to stretch our budget so David could reduce his work hours. During his final month of preparation, I scheduled his study time, made sure he ate regular meals, and created a quiet environment where he could focus completely on passing the exam. More significantly, I became our sole financial support during that crucial period. For 3 months, my nursing salary covered everything: our mortgage, utilities, groceries, David's exam fees, and the review courses he needed. I picked up extra shifts whenever possible, working double weekends and covering for colleagues who needed time off. My hands, already worn from years of physical work, became even more calloused from the additional hours of patient care. I remember those nights vividly. I would come home after a 12-hour shift, my feet aching and my back sore from lifting patients and running between rooms all day. David would be hunched over his books at our kitchen table, surrounded by highlighters and legal pads covered in his careful handwriting. I would quietly make dinner, set a plate beside him without interrupting his concentration, and then sit nearby with my own work, reviewing patient charts or updating care plans. We didn't have much conversation during those months, but we had something deeper: complete trust in each other's commitment to our shared future. I never questioned whether supporting him financially was the right choice, and he never took my sacrifice for granted. We both understood that this was temporary, that we were investing in something bigger than our individual careers. When David passed the bar exam with flying colors, we celebrated quietly at home with takeout pizza and a bottle of wine we'd been saving for the occasion. But the real victory wasn't just his test scores. It was knowing that we had navigated a difficult period without losing sight of our partnership. That success opened doors for David professionally. Within 6 months, he received a significant raise and was assigned to more prominent cases. Our financial situation improved dramatically, allowing us to move to a better neighborhood and start thinking about long-term goals like home ownership and family planning. But even as our external circumstances improved, I continued to be the invisible architect of our daily life. I researched neighborhoods, toured houses, and analyzed market trends before we bought our first home. I managed our investment accounts, tracked our retirement savings, and made sure we were building wealth responsibly rather than just earning. I also became David's emotional anchor in ways that his family never recognized. The legal profession is notoriously stressful, filled with difficult clients, impossible deadlines, and constant pressure to bill more hours. When David came home frustrated with a challenging case or worried about meeting his targets, I was the one who listened, offered perspective, and helped him process the emotional toll of his career. I learned to read his moods, understanding when he needed space to decompress, and when he needed encouragement to push through a particularly difficult period. I became fluent in the language of his profession, not because I wanted to practice law myself, but because I wanted to be a true partner in his professional journey. Meanwhile, my own career was flourishing in ways that complemented rather than competed with his success. I had been promoted to charge nurse in my unit, which meant supervising other nurses and coordinating patient care across multiple departments. The skills I was developing, leadership, crisis management, detailed organization, were directly transferable to managing our household and supporting David's career. But Margaret saw none of this complexity. During family visits, she would praise David's professional achievements while treating my career as a pleasant hobby. She would ask him detailed questions about his cases and clients, genuinely interested in his work, then turn to me with superficial inquiries about whether I enjoyed nursing, as if it were a pastime rather than a serious profession. What hurt most was her complete inability to acknowledge the period when I had supported us financially. Whenever the family discussed David's bar exam success, she would beam with pride about his intelligence and determination. She never mentioned the months when my paycheck kept us afloat, or the extra shifts I worked so he could focus on studying. In Margaret's version of our story, David had achieved everything through his own merit and hard work. I was simply along for the ride, benefiting from his success rather than contributing to it. She had rewritten our partnership into a traditional narrative where the successful man supports the grateful wife, completely ignoring the reality of our mutual sacrifice and shared achievement. This willful blindness wasn't just frustrating, it was deeply hurtful. It made me feel invisible in my own marriage, as if my contributions only mattered when they were hidden behind the scenes. Margaret was teaching me that women's work, no matter how essential, would always be minimized and overlooked in favor of more visible male success. The moment that changed everything happened on a seemingly ordinary Sunday evening in October. David and I had been married for 3 years, and we were attending one of Margaret's elaborate family dinners, the kind she organized monthly to maintain what she called family cohesion. These gatherings always felt more like performances than genuine family time. with carefully orchestrated conversations and subtle competitions over achievements and acquisitions. That particular evening, the dining room was filled with the usual suspects: David's younger sister Amanda and her investment banker husband, his cousin Robert, who worked in commercial real estate, and Margaret's sister Helen, who had never worked a day in her life but considered herself an expert on everyone else's career choices. The conversation had been flowing along predictable lines: discussions of property markets, vacation destinations, and the kind of cultural events that demonstrated proper social status. I had been largely quiet throughout dinner, partly because I was exhausted from a particularly challenging week at the hospital, and partly because I had learned over the years that my contributions to these conversations were rarely welcomed or valued. I was content to listen, occasionally answering direct questions about my work when asked, though those inquiries were becoming increasingly rare. The shift began when Amanda mentioned that she and her husband were considering buying a second home in the mountains. This sparked a broader conversation about investment properties and wealth-building strategies. David, who had recently been assigned to a high-profile corporate case, mentioned that he was learning about real estate law and finding it fascinating. "David has such a brilliant legal mind," Margaret said, her voice warm with maternal pride. "He's always been destined for great things. Even as a child, he showed such intelligence and ambition." The conversation continued along these lines for several minutes, with various family members praising David's career trajectory and speculating about his future earning potential. I noticed how the discussion seemed to treat his success as inevitable, predetermined by his intelligence and family background, rather than the result of hard work and mutual sacrifice. Then Helen, perhaps emboldened by the wine, made a comment that shifted the entire atmosphere. "It's wonderful how some people just seem to attract success," she said, glancing meaningfully at me. "David certainly landed well, professionally speaking, and personally too, of course," she added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I felt the subtle change in the room's energy, the way conversations can suddenly develop an undercurrent of tension that everyone feels but no one acknowledges directly. Margaret's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, her polite smile becoming more fixed, her eyes taking on that calculating look I had learned to recognize and fear. "Well," Margaret said carefully, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision, "we've certainly watched David's life transform remarkably since college. His career, his lifestyle, his financial situation, everything has improved so dramatically." She paused, letting her words settle over the table like a heavy blanket. I could feel every person in the room holding their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but not sure what form it would take. "Of course," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a tone of false concern, "we've always wondered about the timing of certain relationships. It's interesting how some people seem to have a talent for recognizing potential before it's fully realized." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mom, what are you trying to say?" Margaret looked directly at me for the first time that evening, her gaze steady and cold. "I'm saying that Eve has always been remarkably practical in her choices, marrying a law student who was obviously destined for financial success, rather than, say, one of her fellow nursing students who would never earn more than a modest salary. It shows a certain strategic thinking." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt my cheeks burning, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Around the table, family members were staring at their plates, avoiding eye contact, creating the kind of uncomfortable silence that follows when someone says something that crosses an unspoken line. "That's enough," David said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. He sounded more embarrassed than angry, more concerned about social awkwardness than defending his wife. But Margaret wasn't finished. Perhaps sensing that she finally had the opportunity to say what she had been thinking for years, she pressed forward with devastating precision. "I'm simply acknowledging what we've all observed," she said, her tone remaining conversational despite the cruelty of her words. "Eve is clearly intelligent enough to recognize an opportunity when she sees one. Marrying into financial security, rather than struggling on a nurse's salary, it's actually quite smart when you think about it objectively." She paused, taking a sip of wine before delivering the final blow. "Some people might call it being a gold digger, but I prefer to think of it as being practical." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat frozen in my chair, feeling as if I had been physically struck. Years of subtle insults and passive-aggressive comments had been building toward this moment, and now the accusation was finally out in the open, stated clearly in front of the entire family. I looked around the table, hoping to see shock or disapproval on the faces of David's relatives, but instead found a mix of uncomfortable embarrassment and what looked almost like relief, as if Margaret had finally voiced what they had all been thinking, but were too polite to say directly. David's response was the most devastating part of the entire experience. Instead of defending me with the passion and conviction our marriage deserved, he simply said, "Mom, that's not fair. Eve works hard. She's not like that." Not like that. As if being called a gold digger was a reasonable accusation that required defense rather than an outrageous insult that should have been rejected immediately and completely. I realized in that moment that I had been fighting a battle I could never win. No matter how hard I worked, how much I contributed to our marriage, or how genuine my love for David was, Margaret would always see me as an opportunist who had manipulated her son for financial gain. And worse, David's weak defense suggested that some part of him might actually believe there was truth in his mother's accusation. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and polite pretense. I smiled when appropriate, answered questions when directly addressed, and maintained the facade of normalcy that social situations demand. But inside, something had fundamentally shifted. I understood that Margaret had declared war, and I was no longer willing to fight it on her terms. The weeks following that devastating dinner marked the beginning of what I can only describe as a carefully orchestrated campaign of isolation. Margaret had drawn her battle lines clearly, and now she was systematically working to turn every member of David's family against me. What made it particularly insidious was how subtle and sophisticated her approach was. Nothing overtly hostile that David could point to and say definitively was wrong, but a steady erosion of my place within the family structure. It started with the phone calls. David would receive calls from various family members, his sister Amanda, his cousin Robert, even his elderly Aunt Helen, all expressing concern about our marriage. They didn't call to speak with both of us anymore, as they had in the early years. Instead, they would ask specifically for David, then engage him in long conversations that I could only hear one side of. "Everything's fine, Mom," I would hear him saying, his voice strained with frustration. "No, Eve doesn't seem unhappy. No, I haven't noticed any changes in her behavior." The implication was clear. They were discussing me as if I were a problem, to be managed rather than a family member to be included. These conversations would leave David tense and withdrawn, creating a distance between us that hadn't existed before. He began to question things about our relationship that had never been issues. Whether I was truly happy, whether I felt fulfilled, whether I harbored resentments he wasn't aware of. Family gatherings became exercises in psychological warfare. I would arrive at Margaret's house to find small clusters of relatives engaged in intense conversations that would abruptly stop the moment I entered a room. The sudden silence, followed by overly bright smiles and forced greetings, made it clear that I had been the topic of discussion. Amanda, who had once been reasonably friendly toward me, now treated me with cool politeness. She would ask superficial questions about my work, nod briefly at my responses, then immediately turn her attention to David or someone else. During one particularly painful Christmas gathering, I watched her show genuine enthusiasm for her brother's latest case while barely acknowledging my promotion to head nurse, a position that had required months of additional training and represented a significant career milestone. The men in the family took a different approach. Robert and Amanda's husband began treating me with a kind of patronizing kindness that was almost worse than outright hostility. They would ask me simplified questions about nursing as if I were a child playing dress-up rather than a healthcare professional with years of experience. When I tried to contribute to conversations about economics or politics, topics I was well informed about thanks to my voracious reading and David's legal insights, they would smile indulgently and change the subject. Margaret orchestrated these dynamics with masterful precision. She never said anything directly critical about me in public settings, but she had a way of steering conversations that highlighted David's achievements while making my contributions invisible. She would ask detailed questions about his cases, express admiration for his legal strategies, and speculate about his career trajectory in ways that emphasized how much he had accomplished since settling down. The phrase, since settling down became her weapon of choice. She would use it in contexts that made it sound like marriage had been a limitation rather than a partnership. David has done so well for himself since settling down, she would tell visitors, as if my presence in his life had required him to make sacrifices rather than providing him with support and stability. What hurt most was watching David's response to this campaign. Rather than defending our partnership or challenging his family's treatment of me, he seemed to internalize their concerns. He began second-guessing decisions we had made together, questioning whether I was truly happy, and treating me with a kind of careful consideration that felt more like guilt than love. The isolation extended beyond family gatherings. Margaret had a wide social circle, and her influence within their community was considerable. I began to notice that invitations to social events that had once included both of us were now directed solely to David. When he mentioned these exclusions, Margaret would express surprise and concern, claiming that surely the oversight was unintentional, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. I found myself spending more and more time alone while David attended functions I was no longer welcome at. He would come home from these events with a strange expression on his face, and I could tell that conversations about our marriage had taken place in my absence. He never shared the details of these discussions, but I could see their effect in the way he looked at me, with a mixture of love and doubt that hadn't existed before. The emotional exhaustion became overwhelming. I felt like I was constantly on trial, required to prove my worthiness and genuine affection in ways that no other family member had to demonstrate. Every interaction with David's relatives became a performance where I had to be perfectly gracious, appropriately grateful, and completely unthreatening. I could never express frustration, ask for support, or show any signs of the stress that this treatment was causing. At work, my colleagues began to notice changes in my demeanor. I had always been known for my positive attitude and collaborative spirit, but the constant strain of defending my character and intentions was wearing me down. I became more withdrawn, less likely to participate in social conversations, and increasingly focused on my professional responsibilities as the one area of my life where my competence was unquestioned. The worst part was the growing realization that this campaign was working. David's family had successfully planted seeds of doubt about my motivations and character, and those seeds were beginning to take root in David's mind. He had begun to see me through their lens, rather than through his own experience of our partnership. I understood that Margaret had achieved exactly what she had set out to accomplish. She had isolated me from the family structure and created doubt about my place in David's life. The gold digger accusation had been just the beginning of a much larger strategy designed to make me feel unwelcome and unwanted. While Margaret's campaign of isolation continued at home, something powerful was happening in my professional life that she couldn't touch or diminish. The hospital had become my sanctuary, a place where my competence was recognized, my contributions were valued, and my character was judged solely on my actions rather than my marriage choices. The promotion to head nurse had come after months of additional training and demonstrated leadership during several critical situations. I had successfully coordinated care during a major emergency when our department was overwhelmed with casualties from a multi-car accident. My ability to stay calm under pressure, efficiently allocate resources, and support both patients and staff through trauma had impressed the hospital administration in ways that went beyond my clinical skills. Leading a team of 12 nurses was both challenging and incredibly fulfilling. These were experienced professionals who had initially been skeptical about my promotion. Some had been at the hospital longer than I had, and several had applied for the same position. But I had earned their respect through consistency, fairness, and a deep understanding of the complexities of patient care that could only come from years of hands-on experience. My days were filled with responsibilities that required everything I had learned about crisis management, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking. I was scheduling shifts for a department that never slept, mediating conflicts between strong-willed medical professionals, advocating for patients with complex needs, and continuously updating protocols to improve care quality. The work was demanding but intellectually stimulating in ways that made me feel fully alive and capable. More importantly, I was building something that belonged entirely to me. Every process improvement I implemented, every successful patient outcome my team achieved, every moment of mentorship I provided to newer nurses, these accomplishments couldn't be attributed to David's connections or minimized as lucky breaks. They were the direct result of my knowledge, my judgment, and my leadership abilities. The confidence I gained from professional success began to spill over into other areas of my life. I started speaking up more in meetings, proposing innovative solutions to long-standing problems, and taking on additional responsibilities that stretched my capabilities. The hospital's chief of nursing began asking for my input on department-wide initiatives, recognizing that I had both the clinical expertise and the management skills to contribute meaningfully to strategic planning. It was during this period of professional growth that I stumbled upon an opportunity that would become a significant source of both income and personal satisfaction. One of my patients, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, mentioned her frustration with the lack of quality private care options for people transitioning from hospital to home. Her family could afford private nursing services, but they had struggled to find caregivers with the clinical expertise and personal compassion necessary for complex recovery situations. That conversation sparked an idea that had been percolating in the back of my mind for months. I had noticed that many patients, particularly elderly ones with complicated medical needs, fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. They were too sick to manage independently, but not sick enough to require extended hospital stays. Their families were often overwhelmed, unprepared to handle medical equipment or medication schedules, and desperate for professional guidance during the most vulnerable period of recovery. I began researching the private care industry and discovered a significant gap in the market. Most private nursing services focused on basic companionship and light medical assistance. Few offered the kind of skilled, hospital-level care that patients with serious conditions actually needed during their transition periods. With characteristic thoroughness, I developed a business plan for a private nursing service that would bridge this gap. My vision was to provide short-term, intensive care for patients recovering from major surgeries, managing chronic conditions, or dealing with complex medication regimens. This wouldn't be long-term companion care, it would be skilled nursing assistance designed to ensure safe transitions and prevent readmissions. Starting the business required careful navigation of legal requirements, insurance considerations, and certification processes. I spent evenings and weekends researching regulations, developing service protocols, and creating documentation systems that would meet both client needs and professional standards. David was supportive but somewhat puzzled by my entrepreneurial ambitions, unable to understand why I wanted to take on additional work when his income was steadily increasing. My first client was the elderly woman who had originally sparked the idea. Her recovery had been complicated by medication interactions and mobility challenges that her family wasn't equipped to handle. I provided twice-daily visits for 3 weeks, monitoring her vital signs, adjusting her medication schedule in consultation with her physician, and teaching her daughter how to safely assist with physical therapy exercises. The results were remarkable. Not only did my client avoid a costly hospital readmission, but her recovery progressed faster than her doctors had anticipated. Her family's stress levels decreased dramatically once they had professional support and guidance, and they referred me to 3 other families dealing with similar situations. Word spread quickly within the medical community. Physicians began recommending my services to patients who needed more support than traditional home health services could provide, but less intervention than extended hospital stays required. Within 6 months, I had a steady roster of clients and a waiting list that required me to carefully manage my availability around my hospital schedule. The financial impact was significant, but secondary to the personal satisfaction I derived from this work. Every successful recovery, every grateful family, every physician who trusted my judgment reinforced my sense of professional competence and personal worth. I was building something meaningful that existed entirely outside of David's world and Margaret's influence. Most importantly, this success was giving me back my voice and my confidence. In family situations where I had previously felt diminished and defensive, I now carried myself with the quiet assurance that comes from knowing your own value. I had created something valuable through my own skills and determination, and no amount of social manipulation could diminish that achievement. Margaret might control the family narrative, but she couldn't touch my professional reputation or the growing business that bore my name and reflected my values. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building towards something that belonged entirely to me, a foundation of success that no one could take away or diminish. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was finishing my documentation. After a particularly challenging shift at the hospital, David's phone rang with that urgent tone that immediately signals bad news, and I watched his face transform from casual attention to grave concern within seconds of answering. "What do you mean, malignant?" he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "How long have you known? Why didn't you call me sooner?" I stopped what I was doing and focused entirely on his side of the conversation, picking up fragments that painted an increasingly serious picture. Margaret had been experiencing symptoms for months: fatigue, unexplained weight loss, persistent pain that she had initially dismissed as signs of aging. When the symptoms worsened, she had finally consented to comprehensive testing that revealed a diagnosis none of them had anticipated: pancreatic cancer. Stage 2, which meant it was aggressive but potentially treatable with immediate and intensive intervention. The oncologist had recommended a complex surgical procedure called a Whipple operation, followed by several months of chemotherapy. It was a difficult treatment protocol with no guarantees, but it offered the best chance for long-term survival. David spent the next hour on the phone with various family members, coordinating information and trying to understand the full scope of what they were facing. I listened to his conversations with Amanda, Robert, and eventually Margaret herself, piecing together details that revealed not just the severity of her medical condition, but also the complexity of her financial situation. The surgery alone would cost over $200,000. Margaret's insurance would cover a portion of the expense, but her policy had significant gaps that would leave the family responsible for roughly 60% of the total cost. The chemotherapy treatments, ongoing monitoring, and potential complications could easily add another $100,000 to their financial burden. For a family that projected such wealth and social status, this revelation came as a shock. Margaret and David's father had always lived an expensive lifestyle: the large house, luxury cars, frequent travel, and generous entertaining that maintained their social position. But their actual liquid assets were far more limited than their spending patterns suggested. David's father, I learned during those tense phone conversations, had made several poor investment decisions over the past few years. A significant portion of their retirement savings had been lost in a failed real estate venture, and they had been using credit and home equity loans to maintain their lifestyle while hoping that David's father's consulting income would recover. The economic downturn had affected his business more severely than they had admitted to anyone, including their children. Amanda and her husband were dealing with their own financial pressures. They had recently purchased an expensive home and were managing substantial student loan debt from her husband's MBA program. Robert's real estate business had been struggling, and he was already supporting his ex-wife and 2 children. The family members who appeared so prosperous were actually financially overextended in ways that made Margaret's medical crisis a potential catastrophe for everyone. I watched David struggle with the realization that his family's financial security had been largely illusory. The people who had always seemed so confident about money matters, who had subtle ways of making others feel financially inadequate, were actually vulnerable in ways they had never acknowledged. Margaret's response to the diagnosis revealed layers of her personality that I had never seen before. The woman who had always maintained such rigid control over family dynamics and social situations was suddenly confronted with something that couldn't be managed through manipulation or social pressure. Cancer didn't care about her opinions, her social status, or her ability to control other people's behavior. During the family meeting that was called to discuss treatment options and financial strategies, I saw Margaret display genuine vulnerability for the first time since I had known her. She sat in her perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture and artwork that had always served as symbols of her success, and admitted that she was terrified. "I never thought I would be in this position," she said, her voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "We've always been able to handle whatever life threw at us. I don't understand how we got to a place where my survival depends on money we don't have." The family explored various options. They could sell the house, but the real estate market was slow and they needed funds immediately. They could liquidate investments, but most of their portfolio was already depleted or tied up in illiquid assets. They could take out additional loans, but their debt-to-income ratio was already stretched beyond what most lenders would approve. David offered to contribute what he could from our savings, but even with his successful career, we didn't have anywhere near the amount needed to cover Margaret's treatment costs. The reality was that despite all their apparent wealth and social status, the Whitmore family was facing a medical bankruptcy situation that affected thousands of American families every year. What struck me most during this period was watching Margaret grapple with the limitations of her social networks. The people she had spent years cultivating through charity events and social gatherings were perfectly willing to express sympathy and concern, but none were prepared to provide the kind of substantial financial assistance her situation required. The social capital she had accumulated through decades of careful relationship management proved worthless when confronted with a genuine crisis. I also observed how differently family members reacted to stress. David became obsessively focused on research, spending hours investigating treatment options, success rates, and alternative financing strategies. Amanda grew increasingly emotional, oscillating between grief over her mother's diagnosis and anxiety about the family's financial future. The men tended toward problem-solving mode, proposing various schemes and strategies that invariably proved impractical when examined closely. But Margaret herself underwent the most dramatic transformation. The woman who had always been so certain of her opinions, so quick to judge others, and so confident in her ability to control situations, became increasingly desperate. She began reaching out to distant relatives, old friends, and business associates, asking for advice that was really a veiled request for financial assistance. I watched her make phone calls where she tried to maintain her dignity while essentially begging for help. She would start conversations by sharing her medical news, then gradually steer toward discussions of treatment costs and insurance limitations, hoping that someone would offer assistance without her having to ask directly. Most of these conversations ended with expressions of sympathy, but no concrete offers of help. The desperation in her voice during these calls was both heartbreaking and ironic. This was the same woman who had spent years making me feel financially inadequate, who had questioned my motivations and suggested I was opportunistic in my relationship choices. Now she was discovering what it felt like to need help, to be vulnerable, and to realize that social status provides no protection against life's most serious challenges. The phone call came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Margaret's diagnosis. I was at home, preparing dinner while David worked late on a particularly complex case that required his immediate attention. When the phone rang, I glanced at the caller ID and felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. Margaret had never called me directly, not once in all the years I had been married to her son. Any communication between us had always been filtered through David or initiated during family gatherings where social expectations required basic politeness. I almost didn't answer. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail and wait for David to return her call later. But something about the timing, combined with everything I knew about her medical situation, made me pick up the phone. "Hello, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Eve." Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, lacking the confident authority I had grown accustomed to over the years. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. The fact that she was asking about my convenience was so unprecedented that I actually paused before responding. "It's fine. David isn't home yet, but I can have him call you when he gets in." "Actually," she said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath, "I was hoping to speak with you." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of our complicated history. I found myself gripping the phone tighter, unsure what to expect, but certain that whatever was coming would be significant. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye," she began carefully, "and I know that I haven't always been welcoming. But I need to ask you something, and I'm hoping you'll hear me out." Her tone was unlike anything I had ever heard from her before. Gone was the subtle condescension, the carefully modulated disapproval, the way she usually spoke to me as if I were a child who needed gentle correction. Instead, she sounded genuinely uncertain, almost fragile. "I'm listening," I said simply. "The doctors want to schedule my surgery for next month," she continued. "We've explored every option we can think of, loans, selling assets, reaching out to family members and friends. But we're still short of what we need to cover the costs, and time is becoming a critical factor." I could hear the difficulty she was having with this conversation in every pause, every carefully chosen word. This was a woman who had never asked anyone for anything, who had built her identity around being the person others came to for help, advice, and social validation. David mentioned that your private nursing business has been quite successful, she said, and I detected a note of something that might have been respect in her voice. He told me that you've been able to save a considerable amount from that income, and that you've always been careful with money. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. The same financial prudence that Margaret had once dismissed as evidence of my lower-class background was now being presented as an asset that might save her life. The money I had earned through additional work, careful budgeting, and the kind of practical financial management she had never needed to develop was suddenly valuable to her. "Eve," she said, and her voice broke slightly on my name. "I'm asking if you would consider lending us the money we need for my surgery." The request hung in the air between us, and I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I struggle to describe even now. There was shock, certainly, at the audacity of asking for financial help from someone she had treated so poorly. There was anger at the desperation that had finally forced her to acknowledge my worth. But there was also something deeper, a recognition of her genuine vulnerability and the terrible position she found herself in. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, buying time to process what was happening. $80,000, she said quietly. "I know it's a lot. I know I have no right to ask this of you, especially given our history. But Eve, I'm scared. I'm 62 years old, and I'm not ready to die. If there's any chance you could help us, I would be eternally grateful." Eternally grateful. The phrase would have been laughable coming from her under any other circumstances. This was the woman who had called me a gold digger in front of the entire family, who had spent years making me feel unwelcome and inadequate, who had systematically tried to undermine my marriage and my place in David's life. But there was something in her voice that made it impossible to take satisfaction in her desperation. This wasn't the confident, controlling Margaret I had known for years. This was a frightened woman facing her own mortality, stripped of all the social armor she had used to protect herself and control others. "Margaret," I said slowly, "this is a lot to process. You're asking me to loan you more money than most people make in 2 years. You're asking me to trust you to repay it when your family's financial situation is obviously complicated." "I understand," she said quickly. "I know how this must sound coming from me. I know I haven't earned the right to ask this of you." The admission was startling. In all the years I had known her, Margaret had never acknowledged that her treatment of me had been unfair or that she had behaved badly. She had never admitted fault or shown genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. "Why me?" I asked. "Why not David? Why not call me instead of asking him to approach me?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I know you're the one who actually has the money," she said. "David has a good salary, but you're the one who saves it, manages it, makes it grow. You're the one who builds things and plans for the future. I know that now. And because I needed to ask you directly. I needed to admit that I was wrong about you." Those last words hit me like a physical blow. After years of being dismissed, criticized, and made to feel inadequate, Margaret was not only acknowledging my financial competence, but admitting that her judgment of my character had been wrong. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone, feeling the weight of power shifting between us in a way that neither of us could have anticipated. For the first time in our relationship, Margaret needed something from me, something only I could provide. The woman who had wielded social and emotional power so effectively for years was now completely at my mercy. The question was, what kind of person did I want to be in this moment? I told Margaret I needed time to think about her request, and we agreed to speak again in 2 days. After hanging up the phone, I stood in my kitchen for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant for my future relationship with David's family. When David came home that evening, I waited until after dinner to tell him about his mother's call. His reaction was exactly what I had expected. Surprise that she had contacted me directly, followed immediately by assumption that I would, of course, help if I could. "This could save her life, Eve," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know the money represents years of your hard work, but we're talking about my mother's survival." His automatic assumption that I would help bothered me more than I had anticipated. There was no acknowledgement of the irony of the situation, no recognition of how difficult this request must be for me given our history. He seemed to view my financial assistance as a natural extension of family obligation without considering the complex dynamics that made this situation particularly challenging. David, I said carefully, your mother spent years treating me like I was after your money. She called me a gold digger in front of your entire family. She's systematically tried to make me feel unwelcome and inadequate. And now she wants me to give her $80,000 to save her life. He looked genuinely confused by my hesitation. But that's in the past, he said. This is about her health, her survival. Surely you can put aside old grievances when someone's life is at stake. His words revealed something troubling about how he viewed our marriage and my experiences within his family. To him, Margaret's years of cruel treatment were old grievances that I should simply set aside. He couldn't understand that this wasn't about holding grudges. It was about the fundamental question of who I was as a person and what kind of relationships I was willing to accept in my life. I spent the next day thinking deeply about my options and what each choice would mean for my future. I could refuse to help, which would certainly feel justified given Margaret's treatment of me, but would likely create permanent damage to my marriage and family relationships. I could agree to help unconditionally, which would save Margaret's life but would essentially reward her years of cruel behavior and set a precedent for future interactions. Or I could choose a third option, one that acknowledged both my compassion and my self-respect. During my shift at the hospital that day, I found myself observing the families of patients facing serious medical crises. I watched how they rallied around their loved ones, how they set aside personal conflicts in favor of collective action, how they found strength and unity during times of vulnerability. But I also noticed how some families used medical crises to maintain toxic dynamics, how some members sacrificed themselves repeatedly for people who never showed appreciation or changed their behavior. I realized that my decision needed to reflect not just what kind of daughter-in-law I wanted to be, but what kind of person I wanted to be. I could act with compassion without accepting continued mistreatment. I could help save someone's life while still maintaining my dignity and self-respect. When I called Margaret back, I had made my decision. I'm willing to lend you the money, I said without preamble, but I have conditions that we need to discuss before I make any financial commitment. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like relief mixed with apprehension. First, I continued, this is a loan, not a gift. I want a formal promissory note with a reasonable repayment schedule. I'm not asking for high interest, but I want legal documentation that protects both of us. Of course, she said quickly. That's completely reasonable. Second, I want our entire family dynamic to change. I'm not asking for gratitude or false affection, but I am requiring basic respect. No more passive-aggressive comments about my background, my career, or my relationship with David. No more attempts to undermine my marriage or make me feel unwelcome at family gatherings. There was a longer pause before she responded. Eve, I understand what you're saying, and I agree to those terms. Third, I said, I want acknowledgement. I want you to tell David, Amanda, and the rest of the family that you asked me for this money and that I chose to help. I don't want this loan to be hidden or minimized. I want credit for this decision. This condition seemed to surprise her more than the others. Why is that important to you? Because for years, you've made my contributions to this family invisible, I said. You've acted as if David's success happened in isolation, as if my support and sacrifice didn't matter. This is my chance to demonstrate my value in a way that can't be ignored or rewritten. I understand, she said quietly. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done for us. Finally, I said, I want an apology, not just to me, but to David, in front of the family. I want you to acknowledge that your treatment of me has been unfair and that your assumptions about my character were wrong. This was clearly the most difficult condition for her to accept. Margaret had built her identity around being right, around her superior judgment and social wisdom. Admitting error publicly would require her to fundamentally reassess how she saw herself and her role in the family. Eve, she said finally, if that's what it takes, then yes, I'll apologize publicly. You're saving my life. The least I can do is acknowledge that I was wrong about who you are. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Margaret began talking about her fears regarding the surgery, her regrets about how she had handled family relationships, and her growing understanding of what I had contributed to David's life and happiness. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was genuine acknowledgement of my worth and her mistakes. When David came home that evening, I told him about my conversation with his mother and the conditions I had set for the loan. His initial reaction was confusion about why I needed formal documentation and public acknowledgement for helping his family. "Eve, she's desperate," he said. "Don't you think these conditions are a bit harsh under the circumstances?" "David," I said firmly, "your mother spent years treating me terribly, and you allowed it to happen. This isn't about being harsh. It's about establishing a foundation for respectful relationships going forward. If I'm going to be part of this family, it needs to be on terms that recognize my worth and contributions." Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the moment, because David's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. For the first time, he seemed to grasp that this decision wasn't just about money. It was about the future of our marriage and my place in his family. Over the following weeks, I arranged the loan documentation, transferred the funds, and watched Margaret navigate her surgery and early recovery. But more importantly, I watched the family dynamics begin to shift in ways that acknowledged my decision and its significance. I had chosen compassion without sacrificing self-respect, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my power within the family. Structure. Margaret's surgery was successful, though her recovery proved to be longer and more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The Whipple procedure is notoriously difficult, requiring months of careful monitoring and gradual return to normal activities. During this period, I found myself in the unexpected position of being consulted about her care, not just because I had funded the surgery, but because my medical expertise had suddenly become valuable to a family that had previously dismissed my professional knowledge. The shift in Margaret's behavior began almost immediately after her surgery. When she was still weak and vulnerable in the hospital, she asked David to specifically request that I visit her. When I arrived, expecting the usual polite but distant interaction, I found her genuinely emotional about seeing me. "Eve," she said, her voice still hoarse from the breathing tube, "I need you to know how grateful I am, not just for the money, though that saved my life, but for the way you handled this entire situation. You had every right to refuse, and you chose to help." Anyway, what struck me most was that her gratitude seemed genuine rather than performative. This wasn't the careful politeness she had always shown in public settings. It was real emotion from someone who had genuinely confronted her own mortality and recognized how her behavior had affected others. Over the following weeks, as Margaret slowly regained her strength, our interactions continued to evolve in ways I hadn't expected. She began asking my opinion about her recovery process, listening carefully to my suggestions about pain management and rehabilitation. More significantly, she started acknowledging my medical expertise in front of other family members. During one family dinner, when Amanda was discussing concerns about their father's recent health issues, Margaret turned to me and said, "Eve, you have more experience with these kinds of situations than any of us. What do you think we should be watching for?" The moment was small but significant. For the first time in years, Margaret was publicly recognizing my professional competence and asking for my input on family matters. Amanda's surprised expression made it clear that this represented a dramatic shift in family dynamics. The public apology that had been one of my conditions came during a family gathering about 6 weeks after Margaret's surgery. She had asked everyone to come for dinner, ostensibly to celebrate her successful recovery, but I suspected she had planned something more significant. After dessert, Margaret stood up, still moving carefully but with obvious determination, and addressed the entire family. "I want to say something that's long overdue," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the moment. "I owe Eve an apology, and I owe all of you an explanation for behavior that hasn't reflected well on our family values." She went on to acknowledge that she had treated me unfairly from the beginning of my relationship with David, that her assumptions about my character and motivations had been wrong, and that her behavior had been driven by fear and prejudice rather than legitimate concerns. "Eve saved my life," she concluded, "but she also taught me something important about character and forgiveness. She chose to help someone who had treated her badly, and she did it with conditions that protected her dignity while still showing compassion. That's the kind of person I should have recognized and welcomed from the beginning. The silence that followed was profound. David reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it with what felt like a mixture of pride and apology. Amanda wiped her eyes, and even Robert, who rarely showed emotion, nodded with what looked like respect, but perhaps the most important change was in my own understanding of what forgiveness actually means. I had always thought forgiveness required letting go of hurt feelings and pretending that past wrongs hadn't happened. Margaret's medical crisis had taught me that real forgiveness is more complex. It's about choosing how to move forward in ways that protect your own well-being, while still allowing for the possibility of genuine relationship. I hadn't forgiven Margaret by ignoring her years of cruel treatment or pretending that her behavior hadn't affected me. Instead, I had forgiven her by setting clear boundaries about future behavior while still choosing to act with compassion when she was genuinely vulnerable. The conditions I had set weren't punishment, they were the foundation for a healthier relationship going forward. This experience also taught me important lessons about the difference between helping and enabling. If I had simply given Margaret the money without conditions, I would have been enabling the same toxic dynamics that had made our relationship so difficult. By requiring changes in behavior and public acknowledgement of my worth, I had helped her while also protecting myself and establishing expectations for future interactions. The financial aspects of our arrangement worked out better than I had expected. Margaret and David's father developed a reasonable repayment plan that they had been following consistently. More importantly, Margaret began including me in family financial discussions, recognizing that my money management skills and financial prudence were assets that could benefit everyone. My relationship with David also deepened during this period. Watching me navigate the complexity of his mother's request had helped him understand aspects of my character that he hadn't fully appreciated before. He began to see my strength not just as professional competence, but as emotional intelligence and moral courage. I never realized how much strength it takes to be kind to someone who has hurt you, he told me one evening. I always thought forgiveness was about being soft, but what you did required incredible inner strength. The changes in our family dynamics extended beyond my relationship with Margaret. Amanda began treating me as a genuine sister-in-law rather than someone she had to tolerate, often calling to ask for advice about work situations or personal decisions. The men in the family started including me in conversations about investments and financial planning, recognizing that my practical, money management skills were valuable. Most importantly, I learned that setting boundaries actually improved relationships rather than damaging them. By clearly communicating my expectations and requiring respectful treatment, I had created space for genuine connection with people who had previously seen me as a threat or an outsider. Margaret's health continued to improve, and her oncologist was optimistic about her long-term prognosis. But regardless of what the future held medically, something fundamental had shifted in our family dynamic. I was no longer fighting for acceptance. I had claimed my place through actions that demonstrated both my compassion and my strength. Looking back on this entire experience now, I realize it taught me lessons about family, worth, and personal strength that I couldn't have learned any other way. Margaret's medical crisis didn't just change our family dynamics, it fundamentally altered how I understand relationships, boundaries, and what it means to act with both compassion and self-respect. The most profound shift was in my understanding of what family actually means. I had spent years trying to earn acceptance from people who viewed me as an outsider, believing that blood relationships automatically created obligations, and that marriage meant I had to accept whatever treatment my husband's family chose to give me. Margaret's crisis taught me that real family isn't defined by genetics or legal documents. It's created through mutual respect, shared support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. When Margaret called me asking for help, she wasn't appealing to family obligation or guilt. She was recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that I had become someone whose character and capabilities she respected. The family bond that developed after her surgery was based on earned trust rather than assumed connection, and it proved to be stronger and more meaningful than the artificial politeness that had characterized our relationship for years. I also learned the crucial difference between being generous and being taken advantage of. true generosity comes from a position of strength and choice, not from pressure or manipulation. When I chose to help Margaret, I did so on my own terms, with clear boundaries that protected my dignity while still allowing me to act compassionately. This wasn't the same as the years I had spent trying to win approval by accepting poor treatment and hoping that my patience would eventually be rewarded. The experience taught me that standing firm in your values doesn't mean being hard or unforgiving. It means being clear about what kind of relationships you're willing to accept and what kind of person you choose to be. I could have refused to help Margaret and been completely justified in that decision. I could have helped unconditionally and allowed our toxic dynamic to continue unchanged. Instead, I found a third path that honored both my principles and my compassion. Setting conditions for my help wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating the foundation for a healthier relationship going forward. By requiring acknowledgement of my worth and changes in behavior, I was investing in the possibility of genuine connection, rather than perpetuating a dynamic based on power imbalances and disrespect. Perhaps most importantly, this experience taught me about my own strength. For years, I had defined myself in relation to other people's opinions and expectations. I had measured my worth by Margaret's approval, my success by David's family's acceptance, and my value by external validation. Margaret's crisis forced me to confront who I was independent of all those external measures. When I made the decision to help her, I discovered that my sense of self-worth didn't depend on her gratitude or approval. I was acting from my own moral compass, based on my own understanding of right and wrong, regardless of how others might judge my choices. That realization was incredibly liberating. The financial aspect of this story often surprises people, but it was never really about the money. It was about recognition, respect, and the power dynamics that had defined our relationship for so long. By acknowledging that I was the one with the resources and skills to help, Margaret was finally seeing me as I actually was, rather than as the threat she had imagined me to be. My nursing career and private business had given me financial independence, but more importantly, they had given me confidence in my own abilities and judgment. When Margaret needed help, she didn't turn to social connections or family wealth. She turned to someone who had built something real through hard work and smart decisions. Today, my relationship with Margaret continues to evolve. We're not best friends, and we probably never will be, but we have developed genuine respect for each other. She has kept her promise to treat me as a valued family member, and I have honored my commitment to approach our relationship with openness. Rather than defensiveness, David and I have grown stronger through this experience as well. He learned to see me not just as his supportive wife, but as a person with her own strength, resources, and moral courage. Our marriage became more balanced, as he recognized that I brought value to our partnership beyond emotional support and domestic management. The most lasting lesson from this experience is that you can choose compassion without sacrificing your self-respect. You can forgive without forgetting. You can help people who have hurt you while still protecting yourself from future harm. These aren't contradictory choices. They're the foundation of mature, healthy relationships. I learned that my worth isn't determined by other people's recognition or approval. It exists independently based on my actions, my choices, and my character. Margaret's crisis gave me the opportunity to demonstrate that worth in a way that couldn't be ignored or minimized. But it didn't create that worth. It simply revealed what had always been there. Sometimes the people who challenge us most are also the ones who teach us the most about ourselves. Margaret's years of criticism and dismissal forced me to develop inner strength and independence I might never have discovered otherwise. Her desperate need for help gave me the chance to act from that strength with both justice and mercy. Has life ever led you to create a family outside of blood ties? I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter. And if this journey touched something inside you, feel free to support the channel or pass this video along to someone who needs it.